Back to order. This is a resumption of meeting number 27 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs, which started on April 13th, 2021. Today's meeting is taking place in hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of January 25th, 2021. And therefore members can attend personally, virtually and in person. Everyone is attending this meeting virtually. So I'll just remind you to make sure your interpretation channel is switched to the correct channel, to make sure that you mute and unmute yourself, and then you know the rest of the drill really. Like to get back to where we left off in the last meeting. Mr. Nader had just moved a sub-amendment at the last meeting. We are on the prorogation study at this point. There are 3 motions before us that are in order, and hopefully we can dispose of these as quickly as possible. And my intention is that if we do get to that point, depending on what happens, you know, if we do get to the point where we have voted for or against all of these motions, and we can move on to the draft report that has been circulated to all of you at last Tuesday, June 1st. Has everyone received the draft report? Okay. So if we do get to that point, then we will have to switch into in camera, since consideration of draft reports happen in camera. That link has been circulated to you with the public link as well. So a little in that same email further down, you'll see the in camera link. At that point, we'll switch into in camera. But at this point, let's move back to Mr. Nader's sub-amendment. Mr. Nader's sub-amendment, which was put forward close to the end of last meeting, June 1st, states that the amendment be amended by replacing all of the words after the words disposed of with the following: before the committee begins consideration of Bill C-19. So I was going over this with the clerk, just because I know that I want to make sure everybody knows what decisions they are making, where we're at on all of the motions, what the final motion will end up looking like after all of the amendments that we've had. And I wanted to ask, this that does at first glance, when I saw it, I just thought the impact of this sub-amendment would be to make sure that we do not move on to C-19 until prorogation is completed. That's completely an understandable desire that Mr. Nader is putting forward, and I can completely understand why he would want that. However, when you put it side by side, it's replacing the words of Mr. Blakey's previous amendment, which puts in place a timeline. So in order for me to know what kind of a timeline we're working with, when we remove the words after disposed of in Mr. Blakey's amendment that was already adopted, that is the portion that actually states, and I'll read it out to you, and maybe I can have the clerk also read it out for you as well, in case you're not following me. What it would do is basically Mr. Blakey's sub-amendment had said that and that all questions necessary for the finalization and tabling of the report be disposed of before the end of day on June 8th, 2021, and that the final report be tabled no later than June 11th, 2021. So if we were to replace the words after disposed of, and replace them with Mr. Nader's sub-amendment before the committee begins consideration of Bill C-19, it does essentially remove the timeline that Mr. Blakey had proposed and was and that the committee had voted in favor of in a previous meeting. So I'm just wondering, Mr. Nader, if you can explain to the other members and to me, if that was your intention to remove the timeline, or if your intention was just to add it to the timeline.
No, the intention was to just basically replace that with that. Basically, let's get this done. My concern is that with the way things are going, as some members maybe want to do, they will basically eat up time for the next 2.5 meetings, so that that deadline comes and goes and there is no report. And then we move on to C19 without ever having tabled this report. So yes, it does get rid of those timelines, but the theory is that before we do anything, there's nothing preventing us from meeting the timeline of Mr. Blakey, and that would obviously be our preference. But I don't want us to see us hit June 11th and have missed our own deadline that we set, whether we voted in favor of it or not. Thing is, we want to finish this report and have a report tabled before we go to the next order of business. So it takes rid of the timeline. Hopefully we can still meet that timeline, but I do not want to see the next 3 meetings or if we have extra meetings, obviously okay with that as well. But I don't want to see those meetings eaten up by debating of the minutiae of a report for the sole purpose of killing time to get beyond that deadline. So I live in constant optimism that our friends around all parties will meaningfully come to the table and present their suggestions to the report, and not spend 2 hours debating a comma or a period. But we shall see. So that's obviously this. I am one of 4 official opposition members of the committee. That's I recognize I can count relatively well. So obviously it's the will of the committee, but that's where we're at, and I will leave my comments there, Madam Chair.
Thank you. So your intention is to complete the prorogation study, but you do believe that in order to do so, the timelines must be removed. Maybe the clerk can help us better understand the timelines that are in place. According to what's been adopted through Mr. Blakey's previous timelines, would the committee then be obligated by those timelines to submit a report by June 11th? Because I think that clarifies things. I do believe from my conversations with all the members in this committee, it's everyone's intention, just like Mr. Nader wants, to complete this prorogation study and to see it tabled. And through discussions in this committee, that's what I gather as well. And then we can also hear from the members that have their hands up after you can clarify that for us, Mr. Clerk.
Yes, of course, Madam Chair. So procedurally, there's no problem with maintaining those timelines. In normal circumstances, when all members would be meeting in the room, those timelines would likely be very achievable, in the sense that the committee would be able to sit for as long as it takes in order to consider all aspects of the draft report and make a final decision on the draft report. However, knowing the constraints in terms of resources that not just this committee but all committees face, the ability to continue sitting possibly indefinitely, if it does end up taking quite a bit of time to go through the report on June 8th, we may not, as we know, fully have full control over the ability to continue sitting indefinitely. We know that generally a lot of these types of decisions are now made in conjunction with the whips and the House administration, based on the allocation of resources that committees need to run. So perhaps it's just sort of, I guess, reminding everybody in terms of expectations that despite the will of the committee to potentially want to do this, if this ultimately gets adopted, we may not have full control over our own timetable, which would necessarily permit the committee to spend as much time as it wants in adopting it. If on June 8th, everyone can get, if the report can be processed within the kind of 2-hour window that is generally allotted to committee meetings, then it obviously shouldn't be a problem. But as we know, we don't know how long it might take for the committee to actually consider the report. And so then it does create a problem in terms of timelines in order to finalize it. And before, Madam Chair, turning it over to you again, one last point I'll say is in regular times, what this type of motion would mean the committee would start sitting on June 8th and would continue to sit without adjourning until such time as all of their work is finalized on the report. And that is sort of the area where we're having difficulty right now because of the allocation of resources. We may not have all the time that might be necessary for the committee to finalize the report. One last thing I'll say about the June 11th portion of the sub-amendment that gives the deadline for the chair to present something back to the House. One of the questions that's necessary to dispose of the report comes at the very end when the committee is asked if they want to adopt the report. Obviously, if the committee was of the view that it didn't want to adopt the report after having gone through the whole thing, there would obviously be nothing for the chair to report on June the 11th. So just to kind of...
But that could happen in either situation. I think
that's right.
It depends on the will of all of the members of the committee to want to get that report completed. I do believe in past we have seen, though, if we do have strict deadlines, the committee is more motivated to try to get their recommendations in, get a vote done on those recommendations, and move forward and get it done. But I do understand the constraints. And also, I did want to let the committee members know that today we do have, constraints because of House shortages, administrative shortages. But I am hoping, and I have directed the clerk to try to find us that extra time for the meeting on the 8th so that we can appropriately get through everything. And if we do go to a vote today, we would move into the draft report, take a look at the content of the draft report, perhaps of a day or so to submit proposed recommendations by all the different parties, give the analysts time over the weekend to insert that into the draft report, and then we would have a completed draft report to look at and vote on all of the proposals in the next meeting. So next we have up, sorry, I don't have the order here, Mr. Blakey.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I just wanted to take an opportunity to put some thoughts about Mr. Nader's sub-amendment and his most recent comments on the record. First of all, that I think there is at least a mild incoherence in the idea that we're more likely to meet a deadline if we don't set a deadline. I think the best way to meet a deadline is to set a deadline. I think the deadline, by virtue of the wording of the sub-amendment that was adopted, is actually quite strict in that it requires decisions to be taken. The problem at PROC for a long time now is not that the committee couldn't get through a vote if a vote were held, it's that we haven't been having the votes. And the concern that Conservatives have raised, which is a concern that I share, having looked at other committees and the way some of them have operated in terms of finalizing reports, is that we might not get to where we make those decisions and therefore the report gets talked out. That's why the sub-amendment is very clear that the questions necessary for finalizing that report have to be put by the end of the day on June 8th. I respect that there are administrative constraints in this Parliament. In fact, one of the things I've found frustrating being a member of 3 committees is that I find members on those committees often, don't take into account. They want to go on with business as if it were perfectly normal and don't really recognize that there's a duty on members of Parliament as well to organize their work to be able to accomplish our legitimate goals within the resources that the House is able to provide in the circumstances. And I think often we're asking too much of the House to provide resources to support normal decision-making procedures and timelines that don't recognize where we're at. But I think that members of Parliament can do that if they're not motivated by other political reasons, perhaps, for delay. In this case, whether it's in respect of not wanting to see a report on prorogation or not wanting to see progress on C-19. As a New Democrat, I want to see us make progress on both. That's why I think adopting a strict timeline, getting on to consideration of the draft report, which, I'm not going to reveal any details of it, but I've seen that draft report. I think overall, it's a pretty good reflection of what the committee has heard. I don't think that the main report language ought to be very controversial, frankly. And so there'll be a question as to recommendations. I think if we can submit our proposed recommendations by Friday, come prepared for a discussion on Tuesday, we should be able to organize our work to assign a legitimate amount of time to each recommendation and then hold a vote. Once all the votes have been held, we'll have the content of a report that then we can vote on whether to accept or not, as the clerk has indicated. And if the committee makes the decision that they don't want to report back to Parliament, that's a horse of a different color. At that point, it's the committee deciding they don't want that. That won't be my option. I think it's really important, unless things unroll very differently than I imagine they will. I think on balance, it's really important for PROC to be reporting back to the House. But I believe that if we want to, we can organize our work to come to a final decision, even within the context of a 2-hour meeting on Tuesday. I don't think that it should take us 8 or 10 hours if we all behave like grown-ups and do our preparatory work properly. This is something we can do as professionals in a professional workplace. The question is whether we want it done. And the first way to signal that we do want it done is to accept a rigorous deadline. And we have one as it stands. If we adopt Mr. Nader's sub-amendment, we will not have a rigorous deadline. In fact, we won't really have any deadline at all. And then I think we run the risk of not only not reporting back on prorogation, but also not reporting C-19 back to the House. And that's just an unacceptable outcome to me. I want both, and I think it's still within our power to do both. So I won't waste any more time with my comments, but I wanted to have those on the record. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull, and then Mr. Therrien.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and do appreciate the opportunity to just say a few words and reflect on this. Certainly relating back to some of the things that Mr. Blakey just shared, I think, which are quite reasonable. Upon first blush, when I saw this sub-amendment, I thought, okay, I can support this because it's really prioritizing prorogation and getting that work done before moving on. But I think now that it's been clarified that this impacts, I think, a reasonable timeline. It certainly is ambitious, but I think, as Mr. Blakey said, I feel like it's something we can accomplish. You know, we can put in I think the main body of the report, which I took the time last night to review, I think is quite good, and it does reflect the testimony that was given. So I really feel like the onus is really on us as members to put together our recommendations in a timeline that I think is reasonable, and to utilize our time next week on Tuesday to go through those recommendations from all the various parties with the due consideration given, and to vote on those as necessary. And I really do support the fact that we need to finish this work, wrap up the prorogation study, and complete our work on C-19. I feel very strongly that we have a duty to complete both. And so, I think it was important for me to just share some of those reflections. I really do think we can accomplish this if we set our minds to it. And I agree that we're all professionals, and the onus is really on us to get this work complete. Thank you very much.
Mr. Therrien.
Good morning, everybody. I arrived late for the first time, I believe. I'm here are two comments regarding the French version of the sub-amendment. And I will ask our dear clerk, whom we like so much, the word élimination. Is this the right word in French for to dispose of? It might perhaps be rather settle than éliminer, régler. Yes, you're absolutely right, Mr. Therrien. But the word élimination de between inverted commas might perhaps be a translation problem. And as you said, it should be régler, to settle. Thank you. Now, I'll be very brief. I heard the comments coming from the NDP colleague saying that we need to submit our work to Parliament. Yes, I do agree that this is extremely important because this is not a useless work. We do have to table our report. It has to be well written. It has to be clear, and it does reflect what we've been hearing for some time. I agree. Now, as far, I'm not sure that the June the 8th or June the 11th is set in stone. We still have some time. So that wouldn't put into question the fact that we can or cannot submit it to Parliament. So I will not accept the argument that it has to be on the 8th or the 11th of June. Then we had to put up with 3 months of filibustering from the Liberal Party, who didn't want to have Mr. Trudeau appear in front of the committee. So if we wouldn't be in such a situation if that had not happened. So this is a problem for us because as far as I'm concerned, as a Bloc Québécois, and also I believe the Conservatives did want Mr. Trudeau to appear. And this is why we are put in such a situation. Let's not deny this. Secondly, the report is a bulky one, and I've read it. I have many comments to make. However, and I'm talking to you in a very friendly manner, but I believe that the date of June the 8th is too close. I do not think that it is feasible for us to carry out that work in such a short time. We took more time for other works. And that would be creating a precedent. We are now writing Canada's history, and I want to commend the Liberals for this because they are the ones who said when there will be a prorogation, we will have to analyze them, and this is the first time we actually do it. So I believe that now we are busy with drafting the report and also the amendments and sub-amendments. So we need to have a timeline in order to do it in a feasible manner. Tuesday, next 2 days, that's too short. So I cannot agree, unfortunately, with the deadline of June the 8th, and hence, I think we should push back that deadline in order to be able to carry out a work which is of a good standard. Thank you.
Mr. Clerk, I believe the words that were used instead of elimination de, were au du pot du in the original. So we could replace that in the French version?
Madam Chair, to understand Mr. Nader's sub-amendment, we have to go back and also look at Mr. Blakey's sub-amendment, which was adopted in the last meeting. And
Mr. Blakey, he uses that language, the different language.
Well, the issue is in the French, and none of it is wrong, but in the French of Mr. Blakey's sub-amendment, it talks about, and I'll pick it up, et que toutes les questions nécessaires à la finalité.
And that all questions which are necessary for the completing and the tabling be settled.
Words after the French word régler. But in the sub-amendment that Mr. Nader has put forward, instead of referencing the word régler, it references another combination of words, élimination de, that doesn't feature anywhere in the French translation of Mr. Blakey's. No. So it appears that there's some kind of, translation issue or something, but clearly the intention is to change the words in French after the word régler.
So could we go to a vote on this at this point?
Madam Chair?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm not delaying the vote. I'm just confirming what the clerk said. The sub-amendment was drafted on the English version and then sent for translation to the Translation Bureau. So obviously there was a mix-up there. But the régler is obviously the right word if it's the one that appears in the original French version. So that's all I have to say about that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay. So depending on how the vote goes, then we can have that translation amended.
Madam Chair, that's right. In fact, when I prepare the minutes for this meeting, I'll make sure the proper word is in there, régler, as opposed to élimination de. So it'll be taken care of there.
Okay, perfect. If you could help us with a vote on this then.
Yes, of course. The question is on Mr. Nader's sub-amendment. Dr. Duncan.
No.
Madame Petipa-Taylor.
No.
Mr. Turnbull.
No.
Monsieur Lauzon.
No.
Mr. Long.
No.
Ms. Vecchio.
Yes.
Mr. Nader.
Yes.
Mr. Lakiski.
Yes.
Mr. Kent.
Yes.
Monsieur Terrien.
Oui.
Mr. Blakey.
No.
Madam Chair, sub-amendment is defeated 5-6.
Okay. Next, we will move on to Mr. Lauzon's amendment. Monsieur Terrien, you have a comment?
I'd like to table a sub-amendment, which I think would reflect the will that has been expressed. In Mr. Nader's amendment, the comment was made that there wasn't any deadline, and there was some fear that we wouldn't be able to table this report soon enough in Parliament. So I would propose something very simple. So I'll read it to you in French, and I'm just changing the dates. I sent the French version. I haven't sent the version yet to the clerk. I will read it. And that be disposed of before the end of the day on June 21, and that the final report, rather that the original one be replaced by disposed of before the end of the day on June 15th, 2021, and that the final report be tabled no later than June 18th, 2021. So basically, I'm providing for 1 extra week to provide for the drafting of the report. I can't agree on it as worded, so I will have suggestions to make. I think that we need that week to provide this, but I think we also need a deadline, and perhaps that will make my colleagues feel more comfortable. Because if I refer to what my colleague from the NDP said, he said that if there were no date, then we could end up in a rather difficult situation, or a situation where nothing would be tabled. So I think this is rather simple. The debate has already been held on this. We would give ourselves an extra week, and I think given that there were 3 months of filibuster, this is perfectly reasonable. And if we wrap up sooner, well, fine. I mean, I'm basically just giving us that extra time. We don't necessarily need to use it all.
Okay, fair enough, Monsieur Terrien. Ms. Vecchio?
And that's actually just the case. Let's say we actually do get done on Tuesday. We would be able to go to C19 from, like, there would be no delays, correct? I just want to ask Mr. Terrien through the clerk, but I mean, this just provides us more time. It would, but we could get onto other business if it was fulfilled, correct?
Well, yeah, we don't have Mr. Nader's sub-amendment that he had put in place, so it wouldn't prevent the committee if the committee wished to do something in between or do something when it was completed the prorogation study. That's correct, Ms. Vecchio. You could always, it's always up to the committee, and there's nothing that is, stopping the committee from moving on to other work if this work is completed. So perhaps we can move on to a vote. I don't see why this would be too complicated, or we would need any kind of suspension for this. It's simply going to replace Two dates, the dates that we had first adopted through Mr. Blakey's motion were June 8th for the completion of the report and June 11th for the tabling. Mr. Terrien's sub-amendment now proposes June 15th for completion of the report and then June 18th for the tabling of the report. Mr. Terrien, Mr. Blakey, you have some comments?
Very quickly, you have answered Ms. Vecchio correctly. That's exactly what I'm saying. We don't necessarily have to use the time right up until the 15th of June or the 18th. If we finish before, fine. Quite honestly, I read the report. I have some comments. I have some proposals for some changes, and I'm not sure that we'll be able to actually move through it as quickly as the NDP member would have suggested. So that's my concern. I agree with you. We have to do quality work, good work, and giving ourselves an extra week would allow for that and would probably reflect the will of those I heard speaking earlier.
Mr. Blakey?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just, I want to state the obvious, which is that, when this sub-amendment was first presented, I believe it was last Thursday, and I had hoped that we might get to a vote on that. We didn't even manage to get to a vote on it this Tuesday. So, what has become an unreasonable delay in part because of a lack of being able to get to a decision, or not delay, but délai en français, what has become a tight deadline was not as tight a deadline when it was first proposed. In fact, it largely mirrored the deadline that Monsieur Terrien is now proposing. I'm happy to have a slight extension of the time allowed for the prorogation report, provided that we can nevertheless start some meetings on C19 in the time in between. And it seems to me that we could. Monsieur Terrien, of course, disagrees, but I think that if we wanted to, we could get it done. It would be difficult to get it done, but that we could finalize a report by Tuesday. I certainly think that we can do that by the 15th. And I think that we could do that while allocating some of the intervening meetings. We're talking about the meeting now on the 8th, the 10th, and the 15th. I think only one or two of those, or 1.5 of those, would actually have to be spent on the prorogation report itself. That would also perhaps provide a little bit more flexibility to the House, who are under some administrative constraints, I understand, and perhaps we could find time for an extra meeting somewhere in there as well. So I think that this is reasonable. I like the fact that we still have a deadline, both for finalizing the report, deciding all the questions, and then tabling the report, but I would not want to do this if it meant that we weren't going to begin our study of C19. I think this timeline provides time for us to be able to do both. Thank you.
Monsieur Terrien, you raised your hand again.
First, if my colleague's implying that I'm against studying Bill C-19, I'm not too sure where he got that from. I'm not, but from what I understand, my colleague from the NDP would agree with these dates, the 18th. However, he would want us to spend some time on Bill C-19 before then as well. I want to make sure I understood him correctly. Does that mean that next week, for example, we would be able to work on the 8th on the report, but say on the 10th, for example, we would begin consideration of Bill C-19. Have I understood that correctly? As long as we stay within this deadline up to the 18th of June? I just want to make sure I understood correctly. A brief clarification then. I didn't say that Mr. Terrien was against Bill C-19. But yes, that is exactly what I'm trying to do. I would suggest that we attempt to use time between now and the 15th in order to consider Bill C-19. And it doesn't matter in that case whether we're using the 8th or the 15th, because I think it's important that we finish the report on prorogation, but that we also begin Bill C-19. And if we can do both of those, then we'll end up with the report before the House rises at the end of June. And we also will have been able to report to the House and table our report as soon as possible. That is what I am trying to do. So yes, Mr. Terrien. Thank you for that clarification.
Mr. Turnbull.
Perhaps this is more a point of order, but I just wondered. So interesting proposal that Mr. Terrien has put forward. So I do appreciate this. I think the amended timeline, I have some concerns about it. I'm also somewhat supportive, so I'm sort of in between. I think if possible, would we be able to have just a quick 10-minute suspension to have a bit of a team huddle on our side? I think all members might be able to take that time just to consider this. If that would be okay, Madam Chair, I would certainly appreciate it.
Madam Chair, before we go there, can we just go through the list? Because I've got about a 10-second thing, just so that those are the types of things we can consider as well.
Sure, Ms. Vecchio, go ahead.
I was just going to comment. I really think that this proposal is a great idea, and we have to recognize that there will be translation, there'll be different things like that. So as we're waiting for the report to before it can get tabled, because there'll have to be translation services and finalization, that would give us the opportunity to be able to invite the minister, to invite the Chief Electoral Officer for Canada as well. So during that time, even if it's not actually tabled right there, the opportunity to start that study is possible. So I just wanted to leave that with everybody as well.
Correct. Absolutely, it is possible. And we've done that in the past before when we've done something simultaneously. Ms. Pettipat-Taylor.
Very quickly, I just have a question. Would we need a sub-amendment for that?
Would you need a sub-amendment for what? For
to continue to do the two studies simultaneously?
No, just the committee would just decide. We've never actually had amendments or formal motions when we decide to necessarily move towards something. I mean, sometimes we have the committee, report back to the main committee and we vote on the decisions that they've made. But like we've always said, the committee is the master of its own proceedings, and so it can do whatever it wishes to do in that regard. You don't have to have formal motions or sub-amendments put forward.
Okay.
I just wanted to add on that with the subcommittee. I mean, these are the things we do need to look at the witness list, and so perhaps a subcommittee should be scheduled so that preliminary work on C-19 could get started outside of the regular committee. So that's another suggestion as well.
If you wish to have a subcommittee meeting, just let me know. Maybe after we get through today, at the end of today, we can decide on that. And Mr. Turnbull had asked for a brief suspension. Would you still like to have that brief suspension? Yes, Mr. Clerk.
Madam Chair, if I may just cut in here on just one point, a couple points. The suggestion for a subcommittee. Unfortunately, again, if the subcommittee does want to meet, it will have to use one of the kind of usual allotted PROC committee slots. So again, it's not like I can definitely check to see if there is a way to get extra time outside of our usual meeting slots, but generally speaking, subcommittees have been meeting in the meeting slot that's reserved for the full committee. So that may impact your decision because it could potentially inadvertently remove some of the time that the committee has to look at the report. But I can definitely check to see if a time outside of the committee can be obtained, but I might get told no. Second point I just wanted to make.
Thanks for that reminder. And then also, anything the subcommittee decides, it has to come back to the main committee in order for it to be adopted. So sometimes if it is something small, it could be a redundant process. So we could decide that at the end of committee. Sorry, Mr. Clerk, I think I cut you off.
Sorry about that. And I'll go quick. The last point I wanted to make, if the committee wanted to consider the draft report according to the new suggested timelines as suggested by Mr. Terrien in his sub-amendment, with the deadline of reporting back on June 18th, which is a Friday, it would mean that there would be an open meeting slot available on June 17th, because the last date at which the committee would be, considering the adoption of the report would be on the 15th, which is a Tuesday. There would then be an open meeting on the 17th before the chair is in a position to present the report back to the House.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Turnbull. Oh,
sorry. No. Mr. Turnbull had his hand up. I'll go after.
Mr. Turnbull, and then you, Mr. Nader.
Thanks, Mr. Nader. So just wanted to clarify. So in terms of this discussion about dates and how we use time and organize our work, we're basically saying June 8th, we'd work on the report. June 10th, we'd work on C19. And then June 15th, we'd finalize the report and table it June 18th. Am I understanding that correctly?
There's been no decision made on that timeline. I think the only thing, at least Ms. Vecchio was suggesting, was that after the report is done, that we could, in that in-between period, while translation and stuff is happening, that we could have a meeting. But we could, what you have proposed, we could do that. But I feel like we're putting the cart before the horse right now. This is stuff that we're supposed to discuss after we've had these motions passed and we start the study. If we do find ourselves having it completed, then of course we could move on to C19 very quickly. So, but that is something we can discuss in terms of timelines and how we organize ourselves at some point. I'd just like to, we have a link set up for an in-camera meeting today, and hopefully we get to use it for some review of the body of the report. Mr. Nader, you had a comment as well?
Well, that was effectively to the end of where I was going. We do have the meeting on the 15th, but the 17th. Ideally, I think we'd want the minister, but why don't we get through this process first, and then perhaps even in the next day or so, if we get through this process, we begin sending in suggestions for that meeting. Obviously, we know who the first ones would be. Obviously, the minister would be top of the list, but I was just going to suggest that why don't we do a lot of this offline to get some of those names in sooner rather than later, after we dispose of our current business before the committee.
Yeah. So just to be clear, Mr. Turnbull, as to your question there before too, I don't think there's been any agreement here today. There's just been a lot of ideas that this could be done, that could be done. I don't know if you're going to find the members agreeing to the timeline that you had just suggested, or the schedule you had suggested right there.
Yeah, Madam Chair, if I could just clarify, I wasn't intending on proposing a timeline. I thought that I was actually just trying to confirm that sort of seemed to be where the conversation was going, and whether my understanding was actually correct, with maybe some consensus was building around that, but perhaps I was wrong. I think what you're saying and what I've heard back is no decisions have been made yet. We need to discuss that after dispensing with this. I'm just obviously a little concerned about whether this delays the work on C19, and so that's something I'm reflecting on, and I think that's really important, and it does seem that it may have that effect. So that's what I think I need to think through and perhaps talk about with my colleagues. Thank you.
Absolutely, it could. That's why I wanted to, although comments have been made, I would not take that as we have a certain agreement to a schedule at this point. So sorry if I feel like I had kind of cut you off there at the end. I apologize for that. My intention was to maybe not get ahead of ourselves and think we have some kind of agreement when really it's just loose conversation happening regarding how things could work. So did you still want that 5-minute suspension? Okay. So suspended for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back to vote on this sub-amendment that Mr. Therrien has proposed. All right, we are on, we left off after Monsieur Terrien has moved a sub-amendment to alter the proposed or the dates that we currently have for the prorogation study deadlines to June 15th and June 18th for tabling. So seeing that there's no more comments on this, Mr. Clerk, if you could help us on a vote.
Yes, I will. La question est sur le sous-amendement.
So the question is on the sub-amendment of Mr. Terrien.
No.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
No.
Mr. Turnbull.
No.
Monsieur Lauzon.
No.
Mr. Long.
No.
Ms. Vecchio.
Yes.
Mr. Nader.
Yes.
Mr. Lakiski.
Yes.
Mr. Kent.
Yes.
Monsieur Terrien.
We.
Mr. Blakey.
Wait.
Madam Chair, sub-amendment carried 6-5.
Okay, excellent. So we have a new timeline to work with. Next, we have Mr. Lauzon's motion before us. Mr. Clerk, if you could help us with a vote on that.
Yes, certainly. La question est sur l'amendement.
So the question was on the amendment as modified of Mr. Lauzon.
Dr. Duncan, are you there? We didn't hear your...
Oh, I didn't hear you at all.
I
Sorry.
apologize.
Completely nothing. Yes, thank you.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Wait.
Mr. Turnbull.
Yes.
Monsieur Lauzon.
We.
Mr. Long.
Yes.
Ms. Vecchio.
No.
Mr. Nader.
No.
Mr. Lakiski.
No.
Mr. Kent.
No.
Monsieur Terrien.
No.
Mr. Blakey.
We.
Madam Chair, amendment carried 6-5.
Okay, now we are back on the main motion as amended. And if we could have a vote, a recorded vote on that, please.
I would totally like the recorded vote. If we could just state it on so that we all know what we're voting on. I know it's on the last one, but
Sure.
that'd be awesome. And then we're good to go.
I went over that with the clerk earlier today too, because I knew that would probably be a request. I probably should have proactively done that. Mr. Clerk, if you could help us read the English and French translation of what has been, what we're voting on now is the main motion.
Yes, absolutely. Members of the committee, this is the wording of the motion as amended. And I'll start in English and then I'll move to French. That in respect of the committee's study of the government's reasons for the prorogation of Parliament in August 2020, the committee renew the invitation issued to the Prime Minister to appear before the committee, provided that if he does not agree within 1 week of the adoption of this motion to appear for at least 1 hour, and let me just go and grab the next part, the non-attendance of the Prime Minister be added to an annex of the main report on the study of the government's reasons for proroguing Parliament in August of 2020,
Mr. Clerk, I'm so sorry. Mr. Blakey had just informed me that he dropped off. If we could just pause for a moment, I think he could probably benefit from hearing the final motion as well.
Okay, did you want to suspend briefly? Or
he's joining in with his phone. He said, okay, let's suspend until we see him pop on. And then...
Bien, nous allons suspendre un instant.
called back to order. And if I can have, Mr. Clerk, if I can have you start from the beginning of the new amended motion that we are voting on.
Yes, I will. The English version of the motion as amended now reads that, comma, in respect of the committee's study of the government's reasons for the prorogation of Parliament in August 2020, comma, the committee renew the invitation issued to the Prime Minister to appear before the committee, comma, provided that if he does not agree, comma, within 1 week of the adoption of this motion, comma, to appear for at least 1 hour, comma, the chair shall be instructed, oh, sorry, I got to go up. The non-attendance of the Prime Minister be added to an annex of the main report on the study of the government's reasons for proroguing Parliament in August of 2020, comma, and that all questions necessary for the finalization and tabling of the report be disposed of before the end of the day on June 15, 2021, and that the final report be tabled no later than June 18, 2021. Je vais procéder à lire la motion telle que modifiée en français.
I will now read the motion in French. That, in accordance with the committee's study on the prorogation of Parliament in August 2020, the committee renewed the invitation issued to the Prime Minister to appear before the committee, provided that if he does not agree, within 1 week of the adoption of this motion, that the non-appearance of the Prime Minister be added to an annex to the main report of the study on the motives of prorogation of Parliament by the government in August 2020, and that all questions necessary to the finalization and the tabling of the report be finalized at the latest on June 15, and that the final report be tabled at the latest on June 18, 2021.
That everyone has heard the final amended motion. If we could have a recorded vote on that.
Absolutely. The question is on Ms. Vecchio's motion as amended. Dr. Duncan.
Yes.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Oui.
Mr. Turnbull.
Yes.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Oui.
Mr. Long.
Yes.
Ms. Vecchio.
Yes.
Mr. Nader.
Yes.
Mr. Lakiski.
Oui.
Mr. Kent.
Yes.
Monsieur Terrien.
Oui.
Mr. Blakey.
Yes.
Madam Chair, motion carried 11-0.
Okay. All right. During our suspension, we had a request by Mr. Terrien to dispose of the motions that he had previously put before the committee. There were 3 motions. Mr. Terrien, can you clarify which of those 3 that you are withdrawing?
Écoutez,
Yes, I will rather talk to you about the motions which I'm going to keep, if I may, because I do not have the third motion here. These are routine motions and we would like to regulate the issue. So here is the first motion. I believe it is in your hands, that the clerk ask each witness to appear before the committee, and for technical trials and tests be applied to the equipment in order to provide the best possible sound quality, and that the committee be informed at the beginning of each sitting of any witness who has not complied with the technical tests. I told my colleagues that because of this, I think I belong to the best committee. So we just want to confirm. So do I need to give you more details, Madam Chair?
Vote on this motion, and then we'll move to the next. Or maybe there's consensus. I know that there's been consensus on these in other committees. So if there's anyone against, Ms. Vecchio, go ahead.
I just put up my hand, and I may be wrong on this one, but the linguistics revision, are we talking about that? Or are we talking, because I'm just kind of looking at the summary of this.
No.
So okay, and that's going to be part 2 motion.
No,
yeah, we haven't gotten to that one. This is the one just for the witnesses.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so do we have consensus to pass this motion then? All right. So moved and adopted.
Merci beaucoup, c'est gentil.
Thank you indeed. I do appreciate. That's very kind. Second, that all documents submitted for the committee business that do not come from a federal department or that had not been translated by the Translation Bureau be sent for prior linguistic review by the Translation Bureau before being distributed to members.
Okay, Ms. Vecchio, go ahead.
You're on mute, Ms. Vecchio.
She's on mute.
I'm sorry. What I would like to look at is the potential amending so that we can add members' offices as part of that group of being excluded from needing to be reviewed by the Translation Bureau, if that's possible. I know Ellen recognizes that
submitted for committee business that do not come from federal department or that have been translated by the Translation Bureau. So you would wish to add that do not come from a federal department or member's office?
A member's office, yeah.
Okay.
That they are excluded from needing to be reviewed by the Translation Bureau.
Has this been proposed in other committees as well, this addition?
Yes.
Okay. Monsieur Terrien?
The issue is simple. Often there are subtleties in languages, and when we translate, it's not always very, very clear. And so I'm the only one who really do not really read English as well as I do French. So it would be difficult for me to sustain some discussions and hopefully to make intelligent and intelligible comments, says Mr. Terrien. So that might be a source of confusion. So ideally, I would recommend that it is translated by the Translation Bureau for reasons of compliance of the terminology. Of course, members of Parliament can exchange letters amongst themselves. However, the documents which would be supporting the business of the committee, in my view, would perhaps have to be translated by the Translation Bureau. I do have the utmost respect for all the efforts which are made. And recently we had exchanges, and I do appreciate how courteous you are. But I believe that we might have perhaps to comply with the standards of the Translation Bureau, and this is my humble request. I believe we have 3 weeks left for that purpose, or a month. Thank you.
So perhaps we'll have to have a vote. I don't know if we have full agreement then on the amendment that Ms. Vecchio has proposed to Monsieur Terrien's motion. Is that correct, Mr. Clerk?
Madam Chair, I don't think there's consent to it. So if the amendment is to proceed, it should go to a recorded vote.
Okay. So could we have a recorded, Mr. Turnbull?
I just wanted to see if Mr. Terrien was amenable to the Vecchio amendment, which I understood, I think was adopted at other committees. And I wasn't sure what his response was on that. It seemed to be friendly, but I wasn't sure. Perhaps we could just clarify that before we go to a vote, if possible. Like, I know that other committees adopted that. I think so. What Ms. Vecchio suggested didn't seem to be unreasonable to me, but I'll leave it to him. Thanks.
I believe Mr. Therrien wishes that the members' offices also comply and have their stuff done through Translation Bureau, but Mr. Therrien, maybe you can explain it better.
To translate is a profession. And I know that we have talented people in our members' offices, but translation is a profession. So we do want the words that I use are the absolutely the equivalent. So we want a high standard translation, and we have to be extremely accurate when we submit a viewpoint. So yes, we might agree that members' offices are able to do it, but if we want the most precise translation possible, we have to do it through professionals. And our clerk might perhaps manage to give us a translation that is provided by specialists, and that would avoid falling into confusion, because we keep boasting that we have two official languages. One of the consequences of having two official languages is that the message should be translated into French or into English with the utmost accuracy. So I'm asking this very humbly. That doesn't mean that there's no precedent. And I believe that if we really want that our country is a bilingual country, that should be taken for granted that we go through the Translation Bureau.
Give consent to this amendment to include members' offices. That's how I see your comments. So, Mr. Clerk, if we could go to... Yes,
I'm
Mr.
sorry,
Trimble?
I have my hand up. I just need another point of clarification because I wasn't sure whether this was conversational, good exchange. I totally agree. I just want to be clear. Did Ms. Vecchio move an amendment? That's what I wasn't clear on. If she did, then I guess we have to dispense with that first. And perhaps I wasn't sure if whether we were going to vote on the main motion or whether there was an amendment actually put forward.
I saw it as an amendment being put forward to include the words members' offices or members' offices. And so we would just vote on Ms. Vecchio's amendment at this time, since it hasn't been incorporated yet into the main motion. Mr. Therrien has not, seen it as a friendly amendment. So we will just vote on the inclusion of those words. Then we will move to a vote on the main motion. Mr. Clerk? Oh, sorry, there's more hands up. Sorry, Ms. Pettipat-Taylor and then Dr. Duncan.
I am so sorry, Madam Chair. I just want to know what we're voting on right now. If you could just read that Ms. Vecchio's amendment, that would be great. I just think we're a bit confused, or perhaps I'm confused.
Okay. So the clerk can, I guess, read out to you in both official languages the motion with the amendment, but we would be just voting on the amendment. Mr. Clerk, if you could help us with that.
Sure, Madam Chair. Ms. Vecchio's amendment is to add the words after the word federal department, comma, members' offices. And that would end up reading as follows for the full motion: that all documents submitted for committee business that do not come from a federal department, comma, or a member's office, or that have not been translated by the Translation Bureau, be sent for prior linguistic review by the Translation Bureau before being distributed to members. Je peux le lire en français.
And I can read it in French now. Including Ms. Vecchio's amendment, it would read as follows: that all documents submitted for committee business that do not come from a federal department, comma, or a member's office, comma, or that have not been translated by the Translation Bureau, be sent for prior linguistic review by the Translation Bureau before being distributed to members.
So a lot of our stuff is translated through the Translation Bureau. In this motion, there's been an exception made for stuff that comes to committee from federal departments. Ms. Vecchio wants that same exception to be made for stuff that comes from members' offices. Perhaps I'm assuming from some of what Ms. Vecchio has said is because of the added burden that may impose on members' offices, is what I assume. And then obviously the stuff that comes from Translation Bureau would not have to go through the linguistic review, but everything else would. Does that make it clear? Yeah, okay. All right, let's move to a vote on Ms. Vecchio's amendment.
The question is on Ms. Vecchio's amendment. Dr. Duncan.
Yes.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Oui.
Mr. Turnbull.
Yes.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Yes.
Mr. Long.
Yes.
Ms. Vecchio.
Yes.
Mr. Nader.
Yes.
Mr. Lakiski.
Yes.
Mr. Kent.
Yes.
Monsieur Terrien.
No.
Mr. Blakey.
No.
Madam Chair, amendment carried.
Okay, a vote on the main motions. I'm assuming everyone is, there's consensus for the main motion now? Anyone against adopting Mr. Terrien's motion as amended? Okay, motion carried. All right, so we have disposed of those motions that have been put on notice for a long time by Mr. Terrien. I appreciate the cooperation in doing so. And at this point, I think we do have a fair amount of time still if we can all move into camera so that we can take a look at the draft report. I'll see you all in a few minutes. you.